Recognition of a long-denied emotional truth begins not as a clear declaration, but as a disturbance, subtle, persistent, and impossible to fully silence. It moves beneath the surface of awareness, shaping thoughts in indirect ways, bending attention toward a particular presence, a particular memory, a particular feeling that refuses to dissolve. For a long time it is misinterpreted, dressed in safer language, reduced to coincidence or habit, because to see it clearly would require a confrontation with something far more consequential. The psyche is not eager to surrender its defenses. It constructs careful explanations to preserve equilibrium, insisting that what is felt is temporary, insignificant, or misplaced. Yet beneath these rationalizations, the emotional truth continues to gather weight. It reveals itself in small ruptures, a pause that lingers too long, a thought that returns uninvited, an unexpected reaction that feels disproportionate yet undeniable. These are not random occurrences but signals, fragments of a deeper coherence, attempting to surface. Denial, in this sense, is not ignorance but protection. It shields the individual from the implications of their own depth. To recognize a feeling fully is to admit that something within has already shifted, that the internal world has been altered by the presence of another. This alteration carries consequences. It demands attention, vulnerability, and the possibility of change, and so the mind hesitates, circling around the truth without naming it. But what is denied does not remain inert. It grows in the shadows, shaped by repetition, and reinforced by every moment of unacknowledged significance. The more it is resisted, the more it organizes itself, gaining structure and clarity beneath the surface. Eventually, the tension between what is consciously believed and what is unconsciously known becomes too great to sustain. The individual begins to feel divided, as though two opposing narratives are unfolding within them, one that maintains control and another that insists on honesty. Recognition occurs at the point where this division can no longer be maintained. It is not a dramatic revelation but a quiet convergence where scattered impressions align into a single, undeniable understanding. What was once ambiguous becomes precise. What was once dismissed becomes central. The individual sees, perhaps for the first time without distortion, the true nature of their feeling, not as a fleeting impulse, but as something rooted, persistent, and meaningful. This moment is often accompanied by a peculiar stillness. The struggle to reinterpret or minimize the feeling falls away, replaced by a direct encounter with what is. There is no longer a need to argue against it, because the evidence has accumulated beyond dispute. The emotional truth stands on its own, independent of justification. In recognizing it, the individual does not create the feeling but uncovers it. It has been present all along, shaping perception and behavior from behind the veil of denial. The act of recognition simply brings it into consciousness, where it can no longer be ignored or displaced. Inner conflict between fear and desire does not manifest as a simple opposition, but as a continuous oscillation that unsettles the entire structure of the psyche. Desire moves forward, seeking connection, meaning, and the fulfillment of something that feels both deeply personal and strangely inevitable. Fear, however, stands as a counterforce, not merely resisting desire, but interrogating it, questioning its consequences, and exposing the vulnerability it demands. Together, they create a tension that cannot be easily resolved because both are rooted in truths the individual cannot entirely dismiss. Desire is rarely rational in its origin. It emerges from layers of experience, memory, and unconscious association, forming an attraction that feels immediate yet difficult to explain. It carries with it a sense of rightness, a pull towards something that seems to promise completion or recognition. But this very intensity gives rise to fear. To want something so deeply is to risk losing it, to risk rejection, to risk discovering that what feels significant internally may not be mirrored externally. Fear, in this way, becomes the guardian of emotional stability, attempting to prevent the individual from investing too much in something uncertain. The conflict intensifies because neither force can eliminate the other. Suppressing desire does not erase it. It merely drives it into more indirect expressions. It may reappear in dreams, in fleeting thoughts, in an unusual sensitivity to the presence or absence of the other person. Fear, on the other hand, does not disappear in the face of desire's persistence. It adapts, becoming more sophisticated, offering convincing arguments for distance, hesitation, or emotional restraint. It frames itself as wisdom, as caution, as the voice of reason that protects the individual from potential harm. This internal struggle often creates a state of paralysis. The individual feels compelled to move closer, yet equally compelled to withdraw. Actions become inconsistent, shaped by whichever force is momentarily dominant. At times there is openness, a willingness to engage, to reveal, to take a step toward what is felt. At other times there is retreat, a sudden reassertion of boundaries, a need to regain control and re-establish emotional safety. This fluctuation is not random, but reflects the ongoing negotiation between opposing psychological demands. What makes this conflict particularly complex is that fear is not entirely negative, nor is desire entirely trustworthy. Fear contains within it an awareness of past wounds, of patterns that may repeat, of vulnerabilities that have not yet been fully understood. Desire, while powerful, may overlook these considerations in its urgency. The individual is therefore caught between two partial truths, each demanding recognition, but neither offering a complete solution. Over time, the tension accumulates, shaping perception and behavior in subtle ways. The individual may begin to interpret neutral events as significant, to read meaning into small interactions, to construct narratives that attempt to reconcile the contradiction. Yet these narratives often fail to hold, because they are built on an unresolved foundation. The conflict persists, not as a problem to be solved quickly, but as a dynamic process that reflects the depth of the emotional experience itself. The unconscious gradually asserting itself is not an abrupt invasion, but a slow, deliberate emergence that reshapes the inner landscape without asking for permission. It does not announce its presence directly. Instead, it reveals itself through patterns, repetitions, and subtle distortions in perception that cannot be easily explained by conscious intention. What is consciously dismissed or overlooked begins to reappear in disguised forms, as though some deeper layer of the psyche is insisting on being recognized. At first, its influence is almost imperceptible. A thought lingers longer than expected. An image carries an unusual weight. A simple interaction acquires a depth that feels disproportionate to the moment itself. These are not random irregularities, but signals, fragments of something coherent attempting to break through the surface. The conscious mind may try to categorize or dismiss them, but the unconscious does not rely on logic to make its case. It operates through accumulation, gradually increasing the intensity and frequency of these signals until they form a pattern that can no longer be ignored. Dreams often become one of its most direct expressions. In them, the unconscious is less constrained, free to present its material in symbolic and emotionally charged forms. Figures, scenarios, and emotions appear with a clarity that contrasts sharply with the ambiguity of waking life. What is avoided during the day may be confronted at night, not in literal terms but through images that carry a deeper psychological meaning. These dreams do not provide straightforward answers, but they create an atmosphere in which the hidden truth becomes more difficult to deny. Beyond dreams, the unconscious asserts itself through emotional reactions that seem disproportionate or unexpected. A small gesture may evoke a strong response. A brief absence may feel significant. A casual remark may resonate far beyond its apparent meaning. These reactions reveal that something deeper is at stake, that the situation is connected to layers of feeling that extend beyond conscious awareness. The individual may struggle to justify these responses, sensing that they are not entirely in control of them. The unconscious also influences attention, directing it towards specific details while ignoring others. The individual may find themselves repeatedly noticing the same person, the same expressions, the same moments, as though guided by an invisible hand. This selective focus is not accidental. It reflects an underlying significance that the conscious mind has not yet fully acknowledged. What stands out is not merely what is present, but what resonates with something already active within. As this process continues, the boundary between conscious and unconscious begins to thin. What was once hidden starts to feel familiar, even inevitable. The individual may begin to anticipate certain thoughts or feelings before they fully form, sensing their approach, as if recognizing something long known, but never fully articulated. Resistance becomes more difficult to sustain, not because it is consciously abandoned, but because it is gradually undermined by the persistence of what lies beneath. The unconscious does not seek to overwhelm, but to integrate, to bring into awareness what has been excluded, so that the individual is no longer divided between what is known and what is felt. The collapse of self-deception and illusion does not occur as a dramatic shattering, but as a quiet erosion of the structures that once sustained a false sense of clarity. For a long time, the individual participates in their own misinterpretation, not out of deliberate dishonesty, but as a means of maintaining internal balance. The mind arranges reality into forms that are easier to accept, filtering perception through narratives that reduce complexity and soften contradiction. These narratives become familiar, almost comforting, because they offer a sense of control over what might otherwise feel uncertain or overwhelming. Self-deception thrives on partial truths. It does not fabricate entirely new realities, but rearranges existing ones, emphasizing certain elements while concealing others. In doing so, it creates an illusion of coherence that appears stable on the surface. The individual may genuinely believe in this constructed understanding, repeating it internally until it feels indistinguishable from fact. Yet beneath this surface, something remains unsettled, a subtle awareness that the explanation is incomplete, that something essential has been excluded. This tension is initially easy to ignore. It manifests as a faint discomfort, a fleeting doubt that quickly dissolves under the weight of rationalization. The individual learns to move past it, to reinforce the narrative that keeps everything in place. But over time, the inconsistencies begin to accumulate. Small moments arise that do not fit the established framework, a reaction that feels too strong, a thought that contradicts what has been assumed, a realization that briefly exposes a gap in the constructed understanding. Each of these moments weakens the illusion, even if only slightly. The collapse begins when these inconsistencies can no longer be reconciled. The effort required to maintain the illusion becomes greater than the effort required to question it. What once felt stable begins to feel fragile, as though it depends on constant reinforcement to remain intact. The individual may notice that their explanations are becoming repetitive, circular, unable to account for new experiences without strain. The narrative that once provided clarity now reveals its limitations. As the illusion loses its strength, the underlying reality starts to emerge with increasing clarity. This is not a sudden revelation but a gradual unveiling in which previously ignored details come into focus. The individual begins to see connections that were once overlooked, patterns that contradict the old understanding, emotions that no longer align with the story they have been telling themselves. The distance between perception and truth narrows, making it more difficult to sustain the original distortion. Self-deception relies on distance. Distance from uncomfortable feelings, from contradictory evidence, from the implications of what is truly present. When this distance diminishes, the illusion cannot hold. The individual is brought closer to their own experience, closer to the reality they had been avoiding. What was once obscured becomes direct, immediate, and undeniable, leaving little room for reinterpretation or escape. Quiet acceptance, replacing resistance, does not arrive as a conscious decision made in a single moment, but as a gradual surrender to what has already proven itself persistent and undeniable. Resistance, for a long time, has been an active force, shaping thoughts, redirecting attention, and maintaining a distance between the individual and the emotional truth that threatens to disrupt their internal order. It operates through effort, through the repeated act of pushing away, reframing, minimizing, or postponing what cannot be fully eliminated. This effort, however, is not without cost. To resist something that continues to assert itself requires constant vigilance, a sustained investment of mental and emotional energy. The individual may not always be aware of this expenditure, but it manifests as a subtle fatigue, a sense of strain that accompanies even ordinary moments. Thoughts must be managed, reactions must be controlled, interpretations must be carefully selected to align with the preferred narrative. Over time, this becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, as the very force being resisted continues to gather strength beneath the surface. Acceptance begins where this effort starts to falter, not because the individual consciously chooses to abandon resistance, but because resistance itself becomes unsustainable. The arguments that once seemed convincing lose their clarity, the justifications begin to feel repetitive, and the distance that was once maintained starts to collapse. What was pushed away returns with greater immediacy, no longer softened by reinterpretation or delay. The individual finds themselves confronting the same realization again and again, until avoidance no longer provides relief. In this state, acceptance does not feel like victory or defeat, but like a cessation of struggle. The tension that once defined the internal experience begins to loosen, not because the situation has changed externally, but because the internal opposition has diminished. The individual allows the feeling to exist without immediately reacting against it, without attempting to reshape or deny it. This allowance creates a different kind of awareness, one that is less defensive, more direct, and more aligned with what is actually present. There is a distinct quietness in this shift. The mind, no longer occupied with maintaining resistance, becomes more still, more receptive. The emotional truth, once experienced as intrusive or disruptive, now appears with a different quality, clearer, more stable, less distorted by fear or avoidance. It is seen not as something to be managed, but as something that simply is. This recognition does not eliminate uncertainty or difficulty, but it removes the fragmentation that resistance creates. Acceptance also alters the relationship between the individual and their own experience. What was once externalized, treated as something foreign or unwelcome, is now recognized as part of the self. The boundary between what I feel and what I allow becomes less rigid, creating a sense of coherence that was previously absent. The individual is no longer divided in the same way, no longer caught between opposing forces that demand contradictory responses. Emergence of vulnerability and transformation begins at the point where the individual can no longer remain unchanged by what they have come to recognize within themselves. Vulnerability is not introduced from the outside. It is uncovered as a natural consequence of acknowledging something that carries emotional significance. To feel deeply is to expose oneself to uncertainty, to relinquish the illusion of complete control over one's internal world, and to accept that one's state of being is now influenced by forces that cannot be entirely predicted or contained. This exposure often feels unfamiliar, even disorienting. The individual, once anchored in a sense of stability defined by self-containment, begins to experience a subtle but persistent openness. Thoughts are no longer entirely private in their implications, emotions no longer confined to a controlled inner space. The presence of another, now fully recognized, introduces a dimension in which the self is no longer self-sufficient in the same way. This does not imply dependence in a simplistic sense, but rather an expansion of the internal world that includes the significance of another person. Vulnerability, in this context, is not weakness, but permeability. It allows experiences to move more freely between inner and outer reality, reducing the distance that once served as protection. The individual may notice that their responses are less calculated, less filtered through rigid structures of control. There is a greater immediacy in how they feel and perceive, as though the barriers that once regulated emotional expression have become more flexible. This shift can feel both liberating and unsettling, as it introduces possibilities that were previously kept at bay. Transformation emerges not as a separate process, but as the natural extension of this vulnerability. Once the individual allows themselves to be affected, to be moved by what they feel, the existing structure of the self begins to reorganize. Old patterns, once maintained through resistance and control, start to lose their dominance. New ways of thinking and responding begin to take shape, often without deliberate intention. The individual may find that their priorities shift, that what once seemed important loses its urgency, while what was once dismissed gains new significance. This transformation is not immediate or complete. It unfolds gradually, often in subtle changes that accumulate over time. The individual may struggle to define exactly what has changed, sensing only that they are no longer relating to the world in the same way. Interactions carry different weight. Decisions are influenced by considerations that were previously absent, and the sense of identity becomes more fluid, less rigidly defined by past assumptions. At its core, this process reflects a movement toward greater integration. Vulnerability allows previously isolated aspects of the psyche to come into contact, while transformation reorganizes these elements into a more cohesive whole. The individual becomes less divided, less dependent on defensive structures that once maintained separation between conflicting parts of the self.